So this is what we in the industry would call a cold open, where we just start right in the middle. Where are we today, Jordan?
Right now, we're in Rocky's recording studio, which AKA is his work from home room.
I like that you've gone for work from home room instead of like study, but yeah, we are astonishingly in the same room.
This is a rare occurrence for us on account of the fact that we live about 5,000 kilometers from each other.
It's maybe the most physically distant you can get, and also, like, if you were trying to maximize the time and expense to get from one part of the country to another, you would probably pick the two cities.
Yep.
So we are in the same place, and we're here to talk about games, and not just like world building or designing rules. We are here to talk about how you maximize, I guess, the amount of fun that you get out of your very limited couple of hours of session, by picking out all the good stuff, and making sure that you do prep that makes sure that you and your players can hit the cool stuff.
Yeah, we like drilling deep into specific stories and finding what makes those stories tick and cutting out everything else and maximizing those bits that you're actually going to play at the table.
Yeah, it's like trail mix, except when you make the trail mix of just M&Ms.
Yeah,
instead of picking the M&Ms out, we're just going to go straight to like, let's pre-pick the M&Ms.
There's all M&Ms. That's what we want.
That's
we are not sponsored, but maybe we could.
M&Ms. If anyone from M&Ms is listening,
Mars, we're open. Give us a call.
All right.
So yeah, we design sessions, not games. That's our thing. That's it.
That's the pitch.
Right?
What kind of session are we designing this week, please?
This day that we are sitting together in the same room, we are designing a session about Dune.
Dune.
Also commonly known as Dune.
Okay. What is Dune about, Jordan?
Dune is a story about worms.
That's it. That's the show. Thanks so much for listening. You can find us
Make sure there's worms.
playcomics.net.
You're good. The players expect that. The end.
I mean, look, not to get too meta, but like that's kind of it, right? It's like, if you go into, if I tell you we're going to play a Dune RPG and you don't get worms,
are we even Dooning?
Are we even Dooning? Like, I feel like that meme is what the show is for.
It's so basic that it actually wraps around to being true.
Yeah.
So I have a long and storied history with Dune.
Jordan is maybe the biggest Dune fan.
Certainly in this room,
Certainly in this room. Wait, why don't I do mine first, because it's easier.
That's fine.
I read Dune the book in 2020 because we had a lot of time. Then I read the next two books in the series. I stopped when it got to the weird stuff. And then I was quite happy to watch Dennis's movie. And that is the extent of the Dune media that I've consumed. Now it's Jordan's turn.
My Dune story began with the Sci-Fi Channel's 3-part miniseries. That was which, despite running out of money at the end, or thereabouts, I still went down. And I also miraculously came across Westwood Studios made a pretty sure Dennis's movies have more time now. And you'd be surprised just how effective they went down the rabbit hole and all of the other ones. And I'm going to be honest, when I was a little bit older, and then I went back as an adult and reread it again and was like, this is amazing. And then when you do all of that extra media and come all the way back to OG Dune, it's almost like an entirely different genre. Like, the story stands alone.
You know, it's one of those things where you read it and it feels tired and tropey because it invented all the tropes.
Dune invented Star Wars.
Yeah, and a lot of other stuff too. But I can see why it was fresh and interesting at the time.
In the 60s.
Yeah. And it did a lot of things and explored a lot of things that, like, even today I don't think we necessarily dig into a lot.
We see a lot of heroes' journeys, but we don't see them like Dune's.
Yeah, and it also, in addition to being about, power and politics and all the things we're going to talk about in a bit, it also really delivered on the, like, adventure story. Like, it felt like Lawrence of Arabia in space.
In OG Dune, we start with, like, a space feudal society that's pretty good analog for like Eurocentric fantasy, the stuff that we all grew up on. And then he goes to the Middle East, and we sympathize with the white person protagonist going to this new location, and then being the fish out of water and adopting their ways, and it feels like that as the reader as well.
Yeah, and you can't do that twice.
Nah.
You don't get to adopt the culture 2 times as a reader. You don't get to experience the setting for the first time more than one time.
But what about second culture?
Definitionally. Yeah, I think that analog between like Paul's experience and the reader's experience, it's like the hallmark of these classic adventure stories is that the reader is discovering things along with the protagonist, and that
their narrative voice is yours.
There's just so much spoilers for the children of Dune, but it's just so much harder to empathize with a half man, half worm who wants to have sex with his own sister.
I'm into it.
Let's move on. So,
all right, first part of this, right?
What are our touch points? What are the things that if you were going to have a Dune experience of any kind, not just an RPG, what are the things that you would be disappointed if you walked away not having had?
Now, I'm going to constrain this a little bit because the Dune universe is so sprawling and wide. I think it's important that we limit ourselves to just OG Dune novel, which honestly is most people's experiences with it. The movies that Dennis has just put out is going to be like a stepping into for a lot of people. So I think it's safe to say that we can restrict the Dune universe to what you would see in that space. So number 1, Dune is a story about worms.
Well, I think before it's about worms, Dune is a story about Dune, right? Like you've said, Dune is a huge universe, and it is one of those like classic massive expanded universes.
There are a million planets that are all off screen.
Yeah, and there's one that's on screen, and it is Dune. So to adapt the meme, Dune is about Dune.
Dune is a story about Dune, also known as Arrakis, the sand planet where the worms are.
Yeah, if you told me I was like, guys, we're gonna play a Dune RPG. That's great. We're on Caladan.
Oh,
it's raining.
What?
There's oceans.
Where's my still suit? It's on my equipment.
So I think like before we can even get into any of the like touch points that we're like absolutely have to hit, it's like take it as a given that you're gonna set your game on Arrakis, Dune.
Yep. It's got to be on Dune,
because otherwise, why are you bothering?
Yeah. So much of the world building and the nuance of the cultures that you see there is because it's a big sandy boy.
Yeah. So I'm not even going to count that as one of our like points. I'm just going to like take it as given that our Dune game will take place on Dune.
We assume Dune.
What are you as a player kind of expecting?
Spice. I got to have some interactions around spice. There's got to be like some mind-expanding moment. There's got to be something where the characters are introduced to like more spice than they would normally be exposed to, and they have some sort of vision or prophetic moment where, or their dreams are messed up. You're in a new place. We're not in Cantus anymore, and this is a consequence of being on this world. Big spice changes you.
Yeah. If I rock up and we don't have some kind of spice enhanced experience,
yep,
and in the game. No, I don't think I want the spice experience. I don't think I'm...
See, look,
I don't think I would enjoy that. I don't think I would thrive in a spice trans environment.
As someone with main character syndrome, I would go all hard onto that spice. 100%. I've always been curious how it tastes.
Cinnamony.
Yeah, but
it's just like doing the cinnamon
nuance
challenge.
To that. It's just a big teaspoon of cinnamon.
Yeah, if this show was on YouTube, we would do our like opening teaser. If this show was a TikTok, it would just be the cinnamon challenge.
If I could eat a teaspoon of cinnamon and gain prescience, I would 100% do that. No questions asked.
I think you do see through time, but only in the sense that, like, you see your own death only because you're about to choke.
Yeah, all the synapses firing in the absence of oxygen.
Yeah, that's the spice experience that we have at home. I want to backtrack a little bit because there was a thing that we opened the show with. it's a stupid meme. But in addition to being about Dune, the planet, Dune is also, I would say, about worms.
Huge if true.
Huge if true. If I rocked up to a game and there were not worms available for my pleasure, I think I would be quite put out.
Yep.
So at the very least, there have to be worms. But I also think that it is critically important that I, the player, or my character, gets to ride the worm.
That's an interesting one. Because if you want to ride the worm, you also have to somehow be connected to the Fremen.
Yeah.
Right? People who aren't Fremen don't ride worms.
Yeah.
They don't even know it's possible.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Who do you see us as being in a game about worms? Because you're right, like canonically only the Fremen and only the initiated Fremen, I guess, get to ride the worms and are taught how to ride the worms. But we've also kind of touched on the fact that, like, at least in the book, we're coming along with the hero as they kind of discover this culture for a first time, and they go for something that's superficially familiar to us, you know, as Eurocentric people, and they're going into something that is a little bit different. So who are the players in a Dune game? Do we just follow the sort of Dune book example? Are they off-worlders and they arrive on Dune and the players and the characters get to experience arriving together? Or is it possible to run a game where you're all Fremen and you're all riding worms from the top?
I feel like you've got to have both feet in one world or the other. I think you can absolutely play an all Fremen game.
Oops, all Fremen.
Oops, all Fremen. I think you can easily follow the book narrative where we're all off-worlders and we all live in that world and now we're subjected to this new one. I think it's going to be hard to mix those two together.
At least, I think, without completely just ripping off the plot of the book.
Yeah, exactly. Like, if you want to tell an original story, I think it's going to be really hard to weave those together. If you have some players that are Fremen and some players that are off-worlders, they have wildly different power structures and motivations behind them. There's not enough that an off-worlder can do in the Fremen world unless they're Paul Atreides.
Yep.
And there's not enough that a Fremen can do in the world of the Landsraad, like the political collective of the off-worlders, because they're not taken seriously. They're considered a primitive savage.
So you reckon we've got to be all one or all the other?
I think so. I think it's much easier to frame a story where everyone's on the same side with similar motivations.
Yeah, okay. Here, let me reframe my, I guess, touch point then. If I'm not going to ride a worm, I want to fight a worm.
Mm-hmm. I think you can absolutely have like the classic harvester scene. That could easily be a thing that you slip in.
That would scratch my itch.
Yep, like worm exists and is like the biggest set piece of this scene.
Yep.
Like all tension comes back to worm.
That would satisfy me. Mm-hmm. That would satisfy my craving for worm.
Alternatively, if you're going to be all Fremen, it can be like the initiation of like, oh, you got to catch a big one. You got to ride this worm.
Not that big.
Not that big. Big grandfather worm.
Grandfather worm.
Biggest we've ever seen.
Biggest we've ever seen. That's a movie spoiler.
Yeah, you should absolutely not be listening to this if you intend on watching that film. So, I reckon for the purposes of this discussion, let's assume we're not Fremen. Let's assume we're off-worlders.
Sure.
Because that gives us greater access to the world outside of the planet as well.
Yep.
And I think that's a good space. Like the interface between Dune and the rest of the Empire, I think is a really good space to play. Because that lets us get into politicking. Dune is a movie about politicking.
Yeah, and that's so intricately tied to all the stuff we've talked about so far. The Fremen and the spice and the worm and the planet, right? Mm-hmm. Like the planet and the trappings of the planet and the ecosystem of the planet, all of that is the thing that everyone is squabbling over on the galactic stage, right?
Mm. In the million odd worlds of the human empire, the known universe, only one of them is unique, and it's Arrakis.
Yeah.
The only place where spice is, So that's where power is.
And he who controls the spice controls the universe. So yeah, in addition to, I guess, spice showing up on a individual sort of player level, spice is also interesting as like an economic force and a political force, and it's a prize, it's a currency.
Is basically money, right?
Well, I think it's more than money, because unlike money, you can eat it and it makes you live forever.
Yep, that's true.
Which may shock the Peter Thiels of the world, that you cannot eat your money and become immortal, but you can in Dune. He who controls the spice who controls the universe, and so in addition to being about worms, or I guess as an extension of being about worms and spice, Dune is a story about who controls the worms and who controls the spice, and the machinations, political, military, otherwise,
feudal society where houses wield significant power and dominion over their worlds, right? And if they get control of Dune and they're the ones responsible for supplying the entire rest of the universe with this substance, they wield incredible power.
But also have an incredible, like, the stakes
Yeah.
are so, dare I say,
Could not be higher.
with great power comes great responsibility.
Man, Spider-Man would not thrive in a desert world.
It's the little spiders you've got to worry about.
So, I think the microcosm of this one place that wields inordinate amount of power and attracts inordinate amount of danger is a fantastic place for us to put our story, right? We've got, the entire first book is about a house not wanting to, but being forced to accept the burden of shifting their whole power structure to Dune.
Yeah, it's the classic, like, it's a gift, but it's not really a gift.
Yeah, it's a gift, but it's a trap.
Yeah.
And we see that play out through the story. Like, even knowing that it's a trap, there's no way that they could have said no because of the politics behind the situation.
As a player, I want to see the worm and have the spice, but I don't think it feels like a Dune story if you're just, like, rocking up and guarding a harvester as it crosses the desert, right? Like, you want to feel embroiled in this kind of aspect of the world. And I know that particularly, and I think this is a thing that's worth touching on, Jordan in particular as a DM wants to, like, that's one of the toy boxes that you like, right? And the DM is a player.
Can't get enough of it.
DM is a player, or GM is a player just as much as the, like, the character players. I want to make the distinction between, like, the GM is also a player, and you also get to have fun in the setting.
Yeah, I want novelty to happen at me as a GM.
And so as the person who is controlling, by definition, I think, all the houses but the one that the players are aligned with, those machinations are where I think a significant chunk of the GM's fun is going to come from, is like setting up those rivalries and relationships and debts owed and favored, like all of that stuff, that web of connections,
intrigue.
Setting that up is going to be something that the players want to do so it feels Doony, but it's also, I think, important to note that is a really fun sandpit for the GM to play into.
This sandpit on this desert world is so rich with opportunity.
I did that on purpose.
Dune, out of most sci-fi media that I've consumed, Dune is one of the few that plays on the massive scale and the micro scale just as effectively. So I think we can very easily put our players in that, like, they are the movers and shakers doing things on a character-to-character level, but then we can zoom out and see the ramifications of their actions in, like, enormous power structures shifting around that.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things about Dune is because everything's so codified, despite the fact that this is a galaxy-spanning story, because there's all these rules about how you can and can't do war and how you can and can't take over a planet, and how all of the forces are quite human scale still. So it's like, because we exist in this structure of legitimized assassination and hand-to-hand combat and one-on-one duels, and everyone's force is like, they're not million-strong armies. I mean, they are eventually, but like in I guess the status quo as we arrive into it at the start of Dune Part 1, they're not like billion-strong armies, and you don't have to be a general. It's actually perfectly sane for the Duke's son and the Duke's lieutenant and a small group of soldiers to go out and guard a harvester, right? And then they come back and they have the banquet in the hall, and suddenly the machinations are like, who controls the planet, who's the traitor? So you can have this very gritty, like hand-to-hand, street-level, quote unquote adventure with the same characters that you are having. The chess moves
chess is what I like there.
Yeah, the chess moves that like decide who controls the spice, and who doing so controls the universe, right? Like, because all those rules and traditions are in place, you actually get to use the same characters at every scale, and that's something quite unique in RPG settings. Usually, if you're killing 10 rats in the basement, you're not affecting the fate of the world, and vice versa.
Yeah.
And Dune, because you're not allowed to have a million-strong army, and you're not allowed to use the atomic warheads, you do both. You decide the fate of worlds, and you do it by...
Yeah, we can proxy.
Yeah, exactly.
We can proxy these enormous battles down to a few individuals. And if you do start conducting war outside of these rules, literally everyone else will turn against you. So you've got this stable balance here, where instead of going and doing a big war, we do lots of little skirmishes, and we do lots of assassinations, and we play a game by political rules instead of open military rules.
Yeah, and that's a really cool opportunity for players and GMs. It's not one that necessarily comes up super often.
Like 80% of Dune as a novel is not about the Fremen fighting a war. It's about trying to find out who the traitor is in the Atreides house.
Yeah.
And it's such a tight micro scale, like every glance is meaningful. Every exchange of words carries so much weight in there. And that's what I want to see at the table.
I actually think if you're thinking about a framework or a structure of like, what are the things that a Dune story needs? It is actually Dennis's part 1 and Dennis's part 2. Like, yeah, I want the part 2, which is the worms and the Fremen and the desert power. But I also want everything that's in part 1, which is not quite as top of mind at the moment because it didn't come out like,
2 weeks ago.
But yeah, that whole movie was exactly what you just said. It was maneuvering and assassinations in the shadows and like gambits and traps, and
we build up to this point where everything works together to enable the big battle at the end.
Yeah.
But that big battle couldn't have been launched any point earlier.
Exactly. And everything sort of teeters, it reaches this sort of tipping point where the things kind of escalate, right?
Yeah, I do love that. I think that's a great way of describing the snowball of conflict in there. Where, like, at the start, it's a big deal that one dude tried to assassinate Paul. And by the end, he has tens of thousands of warriors behind his back, and he's just in the thick of the fighting, killing people left, right, and center as he walks up to the Emperor, the most bold thing in the galaxy. Like, that's an excellent snowball.
Yeah.
And I think we might be jumping ahead a little bit here, but I think that's where your system really matters, because you can't play a crunchy system that's going to work at such a high level and such a low level at the same time.
I mean, we're probably just about ready to start diving into that, I reckon.
Yeah. Real quick recap of the things that I think are super important touch points. First, Dune. Got to be the Dune, the Arrakis. I want spice. I want worms. Those are features that we can put into the story, into the set pieces.
Yeah.
But then the actual gameplay, I want to be about the politicking that's going on behind the scenes, the big moves that players can make and see the reverberations throughout the story. I want to see some like assassination attempts, encounter attempts. I want to see some like duels that are proxies for a much bigger fight between, two powerful wills.
Yeah, we want spies, we want traitors, we want bribery and corruption.
Yeah,
we want
I want leverage. And couched in all of that, like we can build out a really complex web of how you're going to get that leverage and how you're going to maneuver, because all the big power structures are at play in Dune. We've got religion. We've got the economic and commerce side. We've got the like feudal etiquette system. We've got executive power. And everyone's favorite, we have military strength and just like
actual
combat
warfare.
prowess. Yeah.
Well, combat prowess on like an individual scale, because duels are such a big part of it. But then also,
ability to strategy, exert force on a strategic
military
level.
Strategy, which are two different skills.
Like even in world, we've got the mentats, who are like the human computers, who are great at that strategy level. And then we've got all the way down to like the sword masters, who are the guys that you want standing next to you in the fight.
Yeah, and that's two characters, right? That's Thufir and Gurney.
Yep.
And one of them is the like master strategist, and the other one is like teaching Paul not to get stabbed.
Yep. He's the space warrior poet, and maybe my favorite character in the whole thing.
Yeah, so that's a good list of things we want. It's a great wish list. How do we prep for that? How do we put things into place such that these experiences that we all want to have are going to happen at the table, are going to be easy to have at the table? Because I have some thoughts on this front.
First up, if it's going to be a game that's about politicking, then I'm going to want like a bunch of characters that each have their motivations, drives, and crucially, their weaknesses. I'm going to want those ahead of time. Yep. Because this is not something that I'm good at spivving up on the fly.
No, that's firmly in the box of stuff where you can think of 100 of them when you're standing in the shower, but when you're sitting at the table...
Exactly right.
Blank.
Like, I want to have the important information about each of these people ready at hand, but the vector of how the players are going to learn that information is something that can come out at the table.
Right.
So I know who this person is and what their weakness is, and how the players find out that weakness is entirely up to them. I can, they can go on a fact-finding mission, they can do some research, they can interrogate their like crew, they can pay someone else off, like an information broker, whatever it is, I don't care. I can feed that information through any number of channels. I just need to know what it is and who it relates to ahead of time.
I think my thoughts are pretty similar, but kind of flipped. And so that's less about what I am necessarily prepping for myself as the game master, and more about how I'm encouraging the players to kind of engage with this. So the default in a lot of settings, in a lot of games, right, is that these social skills either get abstracted down to one role,
like D&D 3E.
Yeah, like D&D, where it's like you roll diplomacy. Yep. Great, the diplomacy happens. Or if you go old school enough, it's like there's no rules for it at all, and the player's skills are the same as the character's skills, right?
Yeah, so like the character is just an avatar for the player's acumen.
Right. So like maybe if you're playing a really old school RPG, if the player remembers, oh, we've got some dirt on that guy, then the player can have their character use that as leverage. But that needs your player to be good at doing blackmail in real life, right? They need to have a brain that works that way.
And they're not going to be standing in that shower with me while I'm having my shower thoughts being like, this is such a cool thing. Imagine if they engage this way.
Right. We don't make players do their combat for real.
Yeah, I hope. I see what you mean.
We don't make players do their combat for real, but in a lot of systems, we, again, either completely abstract away this stuff, or we make them do their blackmailing for real. We make them keep track of that. So I think one of the things that I'm going to want to bring to the table, physically bring to the table as a game master, is some way to help the players keep track of what their menu of options is in the same way that they could look at their menu of options in a D&D 5e game and they can look through their spell book, right? And they're like,
these are my feats.
Exactly. I'm not an actual wizard, but I know that I have these options in play.
Yep. I can change the world by invoking
through this selection of items. And sure, like maybe if you have a particularly creative DM, there's ways to branch out beyond that and create your own spells or create magical effects that are like unnecessarily contained in the spellbook, and that's fine and wonderful. But we have as this starting place, like, yeah, if you're a wizard, you're not expected to come up with magic on your own as a player. You're not expected to know how magic works. You have a starting list of options to select from. I think a really important thing to have in a Dune game is a similar product, a similar structure, a similar,
like a player-facing aid.
Yeah, a similar set of options for the players to do their political maneuvering. And that probably looks a lot like a burn book, right? And you could do it in universe as like, the players are keeping dossiers or journals or whatever. But it can also just be like every time the players get a bit of leverage on somewhere, you write it down for them on an index card, because we love an index card, and you put it on the table or on your board, like a pin-up board, full like...
You know what this is like? In my game of Spire right now, we have what is colloquially known as a Charlie board. Charlie from Always Sunny.
Yeah,
as he tries to find out who Pepe Sylvia is.
That is exactly what I'm thinking of.
It's our murder board.
Yeah, it's a like a crazy conspiracy theorist board, except it's not crazy because he's in this universe. The conspiracies are real. But they need that play aid the same way they need a spell book or a character sheet in another game.
Keeps track of all of the levers they can pull.
Yeah, and
are expected to pull.
Right. The same way, like at your basic level of D&D play, everyone's quite happily like pulling stuff from their character sheets, and that's plenty of fun for lots of people. And then at your more advanced levels of D&D, or your more, improv-y levels of D&D, you've got players riffing and sort of making stuff up. I think you need to have a similar thing here where it's like, we can have a perfectly fun Dune-feeling game if you as the DM just help them keep track of their various leverages and they are choosing from the list. And I think it won't necessarily happen every game, and that's fine, but it gives you the space for one day a player is like, can I write something down?
Oh, yeah.
Right? Like the first time
when a player says, can I be proactive? And I was like, yes, that's so good.
Right? So you have this potential for like, once you create the structure for them to fill in, it's much easier for them to spot an obvious blank space and be like, can I fill that?
I really like the idea that as the GM, I've got my equivalent of the spell book in front of me. It's got like maybe a portrait of the character that I'm thinking of, so I can easily describe it. It's got a couple of phrases about how I might roleplay that character if they are a character that's going to feature in play. And it's got like the points of leverage that they can use against that character. And then the players also have the same sort of thing. They've got a portrait, but they've just got a bunch of blank space. Like they've got a sentence of knowledge that everyone in world would know about this character. You know that this is the Baron, and the Baron has this reputation, and that's all they've got. And then they can fill in those bits, and I can then see the players' like
thought
game
processes.
State. Yeah, I can see exactly what they're thinking about the thing by what is written underneath their thing compared to what's written underneath mine. I can use that as the feedback loop for like, I'm clearly not explaining this well enough. I need to introduce a new vector to convey this information.
Yeah, I love the idea that you can see all the assumptions that they're
yes,
making.
Exactly.
And use those against them, especially if they're like writing, once they get into the habit of like writing stuff in on their own. And in it, again, in a similar way to where like old school games, you would have someone's job, the player's job was to make them draw the map.
Yeah, someone was a cartographer.
In this, once you get the players going, it becomes maybe the Mentat's job to like keep track of all of this stuff. And you can start to see, again, I don't know that I would go as far as like deliberately like me as the DM writing down false information. But I would quite happily let them write down something that they had assumed and gotten wrong.
Yes, I'm totally cool with that. I actually hate designing red herrings into scenarios.
Yeah, but if they red herring themselves,
that's fine.
That's actually great.
Absolutely fine.
It's like, because then you get to go back and it's like, where did you get that information? It's like, oh, we just assumed.
We drew a wild conclusion.
We drew a conclusion and it was not correct.
Yeah.
It was not supported by data.
I think it's I'm going to say just absolute shit thing to include red herrings in a scenario where you rely on them for the players. Like, they're time wasters and they send your players off on goose chases. And I don't think that's fun as a player, so I would never do that as a GM. But when players make their own goose chases, that's great story. So when they record their own incorrect information, that's a little bit of fun.
Yeah.
If they're only recording incorrect information, that means that I fucked up as the GM. Yeah. I have done bad things. But if it's like one bit here and there, I love that. Like in Escape Room Design, Apophenia, where people, like, they know they're in a game. They know they're supposed to be drawing connections between things. So everything they see suddenly has a connection.
Connections where none exist.
Yeah.
Yeah, if everything is connected, then nothing is connected.
Right. And like,
the board can't be all string. And yet that's it's fun to put string down. So you end up connecting things that maybe you shouldn't.
The bit that you said earlier, I think, is definitely worth expounding on. If they're visualizing this information on like a board, like a pin board or a whiteboard, seeing the gaps also is like an invitation to the players to engage with more story.
Yeah.
If they can see there's something that visually they can tell they don't know this thing.
There's a string to a pin, but no card.
Yeah.
It's like, this is linked to something.
Yeah. Or like we've got like that one thing with the question mark on it, and like,
it's not connected to anything else, but everything's connected to something. Yeah. So like, what's this connected to?
Why do we know this? We need to investigate. Yeah. That's a really, like, that invites the players to be proactive in the game. And that, as a GM, is what I adore. Yeah. Because that's where the novelty happens for me. When the players are setting their own plans in motion, I'm now getting to play in the reactive space.
Which you don't get to do a lot, necessarily.
No, especially when you've come from, like, DMing 5e, where everything's prepped ahead of time, and mostly you want the players to engage with those things that you've got on the table.
Because the prep is so much work.
It's exhaustive.
You don't want to go outside the box.
I want to play in that game where it's flipped and the players are like, hey, who do we talk to find out information about this? And I'm like, all right, let's go. I'm playing the game now.
Yeah.
We're making a novel story together, and I can consult my little spell book, and it's got all of the people and the vectors and the things that they might be attached to, and I can easily be like, this person would have a handmaiden, and you are a handmaiden of another person. It's not inconceivable that you guys would cross paths.
And again,
boom, novel scene.
Advanced mode is like, well, who do you think?
Yeah.
Who do you think would have information on that? Like, here's the map in front of you. Like, where are their connections? Where are they not? Like, who would you approach? And I think that's why the play aid, just to bring it right back to the top, that's why the play aid is so important, because not everyone is naturally adept at keeping that in their heads.
Yep. We don't tend to play in a political world in our everyday lives.
Yeah. And the players aren't necessarily going to take notes on that kind of stuff if this isn't the kind of game that they're used to playing. So by putting things like that out, laying that board state out in front of them, you make their options, their affordances, if you like, much more obvious, just purely by making them physical. So I think that's my big prep thing. Did you have any other prep thoughts?
As a structure, I think that's a marvelous place to start. And as we all know, structures create behaviors. So just by having that structure there, we're already encouraging the players to play the political game. Now we need to stock that with things that are going to be fun ticklers from the Dune universe, and our spice, our worms. Like, oh God, I've just had an idea, right? If we've already kind of got this web of intrigue, like we've chosen what the agendas of these people are and the actions that they'll take on the adventure that we're on, that means that when our players engage like in an opening scene with spice for the first time, now I can forward seed some of that information.
Oh, man, you can give them a vision that like gives them their
It's the dream, the vision, it's the prophecy.
That'd be an amazing opener where it's like you have this vision and then they wake up from the vision and you've got like a blank table in front of you and you're just like, so here's how this game is going to go, and you drop like 3 bits of information that they learned from the dream down in front of them, and like this is the start of your web of intrigue.
You could take this even one step further and be like, in your vision you see this figure that's poorly described and is doing a thing that is like a big deal. They're like setting up poison for the like visiting dignitary or something like that that's going to have massive ramifications, and then that's the question mark face on the board. And then
we know there's a poisoning plot, but who is it?
There is an assassination.
Who's getting poisoned? Who's doing the poisoning?
Yes.
All we know is that we're investigating a poisoning that hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, and we know it's going to happen by the like flashes of dream that you have, where it's like when these 3 events have occurred, the poisoning is nigh.
Yeah.
Like we've got it built into the structure.
Yeah.
We're playing off the spice and we're feeding into the intrigue straight off the bat.
I love that.
That's my opening scene.
That's amazing. I think that's a spectacular opener.
Characters arrive from off-world, engage with spice, have hectic dream or vision, and now we are thrust into plot.
Yeah.
And it's like, as with every intrigue like this, you can't let everyone know about it because there's face to be saved.
Look, and you don't want the poisoner to know that you're onto them.
You don't want that. You don't want to let the bad guys know that you're onto them, because that's going to change up the vector by which that person's going to be assassinated.
Yeah. And so, like, as players, the only people with that information, you are precluded from, and I'm going to borrow one of your words here, you're precluded from de-protagonizing yourself, right? Because you can't just run to daddy with that information and let him solve it, because he could be in on the plot, right? Like you don't know who's in on the plot. You have to act on this information. But I think the idea of dropping those first little like nugs during a spy stream at the start of play, like that feels very Dune.
Super Dune. Now the other thing, we got to have a worm in there, right? Which means one of our characters has to be attached to a worm industry. It's like one of the characters that the players are going to have to question, one of the NPCs, has to be somewhat associated with harvesting the spice, or going out into the desert, or being a planetary ecologist, someone who has excuse to leave the safety of the settlement and allow us to introduce a worm as like a terrifying element to be survived.
Yep. So that's our big picture prep stuff. Let's talk systemy things.
All right, if we're going to run this in a system, how's it going to look?
We're going to run this in a system. And look, I'm open to being convinced that you should just run this as like freeform cards on a table as like an improv session. But I think that's a little high concept. I do think I actually want some rules.
We don't design systems, but maybe this one time we will.
This would not be the first time.
Maybe the second one time we will.
Yeah, what are you thinking in terms of a rule set?
So, because we've got characters acting on that real low scale, and we've got events occurring on that real large scale, I don't think we can slap hard and fast numbers on everything. And I think maybe one of the most underwhelming experiences that I could think of if I was a player in this game would be my Paul Atreides analog swings and does 10 damage.
Yeah, you don't want to wail on a worm that has 1,000 hit points and just like watch its hit points slowly go down. Like
the worm can't be beaten like that.
Way to make the worm boring,
right?
Yeah,
a worm is not a thing that you can fight.
It's a force of nature. It's the same way you can't fight a hurricane.
Can't stand there with your knife and slash down a hurricane. Superman can't punch out the energy crisis. To throw back to a very old SMPC.
Yeah.
So in terms of like what system's going to evoke the play that I want to have, it's got to be something pretty narrative heavy. It's not a roll to hit system. It's a roll to see if the story element succeeds system.
Yeah. I feel like I advocate for fate every episode.
How bold of you.
But I think that is actually a uniquely good fit if you're going to use the kind of play aid that we talked about, because fate already So Fate runs on aspects. So the setting has aspects, which might be something like he who controls the spice controls the universe. But then all of your NPCs have aspects. All the scenes have aspects. So all of these parts of the narrative have little tags, and you are able to mechanically interact with those tags. Like if someone has the aspect of them that they owe another house a favor, you can invoke that aspect for a mechanical advantage. If it is inscribed on the appropriate index card with the appropriate Sharpie, right? Like that is an item that you can like double click on and activate.
Those aspects are straight up affordances.
Exactly. And so it's a way to take this like very fluffy, vague thing that we might not be used to interacting with and being like, well, I have a selection of approaches or skills that you can apply. And so navigating this intrigue scape, I might trademark that. Navigating the intrigue scape becomes a matter of like, I'm going to apply this skill to this aspect of this character or situation or of the setting in search of this outcome. And it lets you do that kind of very gameplay thing to very abstract stuff.
It is really gamey aspect of a narrative.
So you're turning your narrative elements into a game. And the other thing that it lets you do is, in order to earn the meta currency in the game, in order to earn your fate points, which you actually need to use to power a bunch of this stuff, you have to let the DM invoke your aspects against you. And so like
there's the structures that you are a part of, like honor used against you.
Exactly.
Love that.
Yeah. And I think that the third thing for it is that, again, we were talking about how like a basic version of this looks like exploring the map that's in front of you, and an advanced version is when the players start asking to create their own connections and their own aspects. And Fate has rules for that. So Fate has a thing where you can spend Fate points, you can spend your meta currency to create a new aspect, or discover, in quote marks, a new aspect, to declare something to be part of the setting. Which is a really great way to be like, yeah, here's the Sharpie and the thing. Like, you have created tension between these two, houses or individuals that did not exist before. That's now part of the map. And that's a thing that you can tap on later for effect, for mechanical effect.
I spend my resource and my narrative time building this aspect. That is now a point of leverage that I can execute on later.
Yeah, exactly.
Great. I think that map's really tight. So when you're prepping this, do you have all these aspects in advance and they remain player unknown until they discover them?
You would have some in advance, and some would be...
some would be public knowledge things?
Yeah, the idea is that you as the DM would know what kind of aspects are going to come up, but they're not necessarily written down and placed on the table until the players encounter them, right? There's there's almost like a fog of war. You could pre-write them and flip them over, but a lot of the time it works better if you...
tailor it directly to the
situation. You write it in a way that refers to exactly... So you might know that there's a bad blood between these two people, but you might, when you choose to write the aspect down, use the exact words that the player or the character said.
Okay, so...
and drop it in quotes and
that's extra
crystallize it down to a particular form.
For me, who has never played Fate before, that automatically entices me because it's no longer so prep heavy. All I have to do is have the characters and an idea of their relationships, and the gameable elements of the table come out in play.
Right. You have your scribbly little notebook, but you're not having to sit there for like an hour beforehand writing out 100 index cards. The idea is always that you write the index cards out as you play.
That seems like a fantastic fit for this.
Yeah, look, I think so.
Yeah.
I think it's a great game to play in general, but I think it's a uniquely good fit for this, where we're trying to encourage the players to do something that's not going to come naturally to them as RPG players and isn't necessarily going to come naturally to them as human beings.
The system that I think is worth giving mention to, another one that I have read but never actually played, is the Modiphius 2D20 system. It sounds like it behaves in a somewhat similar way, where you're playing on scenes by scenes, And each of those scenes has a bunch of traits that can be used in the role. And players are rolling at least 2d20, sometimes buying more with meta currency up to like 5. I'm not convinced that that would be a great one for a one-shot. It's got 3 different meta currencies in there, and it's got a couple of things that I think would trip up players, especially if we're encouraging like our 5e brethren to come across and try something new. There might just be a few too many levers going on there.
Yeah.
If we were going to live in that space for a long campaign, I don't mind it, because the upfront cost of learning those rules will pay itself off.
Yeah. One of the things I'm really enjoying doing at the moment is we are playing like one-shots in a different system every session or couple of sessions. So I just tend to approach all of these episodes as if we're doing a one-shot, but I think probably this is the first one we've done so far where I'm like, actually, I would maybe prefer a campaign.
A long-form campaign?
Yeah.
Or at least like a 4-session campaign.
Right. I don't think it's impossible to have a good Dune one-shot.
It's just there's a lot of content to get through.
Yeah.
A lot of scenes to play out.
Look, you and Dennis both have this problem.
Like, Dune was called the unfilmable movie for a long time, right?
Yeah.
Because there's so much content in there.
Yeah.
There's another thing that, like, I genuinely might try my hand at this one day. I think the Resistance, that spire the City Must Fall is built on, would be a fantastic one for this, if your players are underdogs. So it doesn't work.
Maybe that's for the Fremen version of the game.
It could be, because like you can very easily manipulate. The basics of this system are every time your character does a thing in the narrative, you roll to see how well they do it. If the number on the dice is good, that's fine, the thing happens. If the number of the dice is middling, the thing happens, but they incur a bit of stress and abstract damage against them. And you assign that stress to different categories. It's not all just against the equivalent of HP. There will be one for that, but then there's also one for its stress against their currency, its stress against their reputation. But then every time they incur stress onto those things, you roll another check and see if that abstract damage turns into something concrete in the narrative, and it generates consequences that drive the story forward. And I feel like this could work quite well in a Dune context. I haven't seen anyone hack it that way yet, so I wouldn't advocate for going out and starting from scratch doing that if this is your first time trying something other than 5e, but I think it would be a worthwhile exercise.
Speaking of refugees from 5e...
Yep, it's come to that time.
My favorite question... how would you run this if you had to run it in 5e? You have a group who refuses to do anything else. If you had to try and bring Dune vibes to a 5e rule set and mindset, how would you do it?
With great difficulty. Like, way back at the start of this, we were talking about how if you abstract away some of those political maneuverings into a dice roll, we're stripping the characters of their ability to engage in that story if their number is not good enough. And B, we're stripping the characters of the agency, the fun of them making the connections themselves. And 5e is quite notorious for this, right? You've got a couple of characters who are the face. And in a political maneuvering system, and unless you're like, oops, all bards and warlocks.
It's really hard to... In Fate, you can solve a military problem with a diplomatic solution, or vice versa. You can solve a political problem with a violent solution, which I think opens up interesting possibilities. And I don't think D&D is as good at that. It's very much like, I think in the same way that for dungeon crawls you're just rolling perception over and over again, I think you'd be rolling diplomacy over and over again.
And once the fight has broken out, it's actually really hard to stop one. Like, the player expectation at the table is once the fight starts, it goes to the end. Yeah. And that's...
Which is not how it goes in Dune. You fight as a distraction so you can make your way to the Emperor and declare single combat /
and that's actually the next big problem. Single combat between a player and a mob in D&D sucks. Because ultimately, you're rolling the same numbers over and over again. I don't think you have the opportunity for like a great startling upset or a reversal. it's just whittling down the HP, and it either goes too quickly and isn't satisfying, or it goes too long, slowly, and all of your other characters are sitting over on the sidelines being like, this is time to pull out my phone.
Very hard to do good pacing in 5e.
Like, very hard to do. Like, a one-on-one combat just doesn't fit. Like, the art of Canley and that single-person vendetta in the Dune universe just doesn't fit with a 5e playstyle. The structure doesn't evoke the player behavior.
For the first in several recordings, I actually am inclined to be like, just don't.
Yeah.
Normally, I will find a way to make it work. But I think in this case, it's a just don't. If you absolutely had to, I would be going back to 4th edition, and I would be digging real hard into some interesting skill challenges. Because I think...
which are much more abstract.
Yeah, I think there's a way to do... And I don't know what it is yet. I know we'll probably never sit down and do the work to, like, map these two structures onto each other. But there is a... I can see in my head a mapping between our, like, intrigue scape and components of a skill challenge, like a series of checks to pass or fail using different skills where everyone contributes, and it's framed as like 4 successes before 3 failures.
Yep. Like you signify how dangerous it is by the number of failures you allow.
Yeah. And how hard it is to get there, how long it's going to go by, how many successes are required. Mm-hmm. So there's definitely a version where you keep the like intriguescape map TM patent pending from the sort of Fate version of the game, and also rummage back around the depths of 4E for skill challenges and re-implement those in 5E and run a game that is like probably 50% interesting skill challenges, and your decision tree is mostly played out through the skill challenge mechanic. But like at that point, why are you bothering?
Yeah, you're discarding the big chunk of the rule system.
You could force it to work. And again, another thing I always want to keep in mind is like, maybe you just want to have a couple of Dune themed sessions in your ongoing campaign. Like, you've all arrived in the desert and you just want to do some worms and do some intrigue, and like, I think that would be an option there.
Yeah, if you're dipping your toes in,
if you wanted to do like
fine.
three sessions in the desert in your ongoing campaign, like that's probably how I would do it. I think you can hit some of our touch points. You can definitely put a worm in there.
You can superficially hit some, for sure.
It's easy to hit the concrete ones.
Yep.
I think it's hard to hit the abstract vibes ones, you know?
The things about interacting with power structure.
Yeah.
That's not just I hit it with my sword. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. You, as with so many 5e hacks, you can force it to work, but I don't think you can make the square peg fit the round hole very well.
Yeah.
You might find an angle that it slides through, but that doesn't mean it's hitting the frisson. Yeah. You know, it's not evoking the player behaviors and feels that we want at the table. The structure just doesn't fit the vibe. So, in short, I wouldn't. And in saying that, I know there are plenty of hacks out there for it. I just wouldn't do them.
Fair.
Like, when most of the things on your character sheet are going to be about combat, and Dune is a game where combat is sparse and super impactful.
The weapon of last resort is weapons. Last question.
Mm-hmm.
Would you run this?
100% I would. Yes, 100%.
I don't know that it would be the very tippy top of my list. I think it could be a fun one to jump on while it's topical. But I think, honestly, I think what this one wants is for your GM to be a huge fanboy.
Mm-hmm. If I had 5 copies of me around a table, I would 100% engage in this with the deep backstory and the connection to all the factions and all of the little subtle maneuverings that if you had casual players, you might need to put in a book for them to read, and that suddenly strips it of fun.
Yeah. No, you don't want to give the players
some homework, totally fine.
We differ on this.
Yeah.
I don't think you should have to give the players homework.
The GM does so much homework, the players should do a little.
I feel like the GM should do less homework. GMs do too much homework and players don't do enough.
Yeah, if we could meet in the middle somewhere, that'd be great.
That'd be swell. Yeah, I would run this one. Purely because it's topical. I feel like you would run this one and it would be your magnum opus.
I would run this one for pure enjoyment. Like I would flourish in the
That would
setting.
be a decade-long game.
Oh, man.
You'd wallow in
100%. It. Like, if I can find a group
you get
that
10
would
years and it's like,
sustain
oh
with
yeah,
me.
half of my characters have turned into worms now. That's a deep cut spoiler. It's like, yeah, it's 10,000 years in the future. And one of the players has become the God Emperor.
If I could run a long form campaign of this, 100% would. If I had enough players that were just interested for a month-long game, I'd settle for that too. I'm desperate is what I'm saying.
And on that, could be time to wrap up.
You're probably right. This has been Platonics. You can find us at platonics.net. You can find our podcast wherever you find podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, send it through to your DM. If you are a DM, send it to your friends.
Who are also DMs.
Yeah. We would also greatly appreciate any review you could leave us as well, as long as it's 5 stars. Only 5-star reviews.
Only 5-star reviews. We also now have a Reddit account that you can stalk. So if you see u/Platonics posting on r/RPG, please be nice. And fang us an updoot or two.
I'd love an updoot.
I love an updoot.
We'd love that.
Cool. I have been Rocky.
And I've been Jords.
This has been Platonics. Thank you so much for listening. We'll catch you next time.
Ciao. Mars, give me a call.
That's much funnier because we both know you know somebody called Mars.
I know. Today or yesterday as well.
Happy birthday, Mars, if you're not listening.
Maybe we could get one more listener. Mars, we gave you a shout out.